Now, to move on off of baby formula, I want to talk about food production worldwide. Now, GRAIN is a small international nonprofit organization that works to support small farmers and social movements in struggles for community-controlled biodiversity food systems. This is actually a nonprofit. They are not corporate funded. I did research into this. Now, this article is a bit old. It's from 2014. Hungry for land, small farmers feed the world with less than a quarter of the farmland. We will talk more in detail about this. Let me just take that. I want to open a couple more links and add them here to talk about. Okay. Now, let's start with this one. Governments and international agencies frequently boast that small farmers control the largest share of the world's agricultural land. Inaugurating 2014 as the International Year of the Family Farming, Jose Graciano de Silva, Director General of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, sang the praise of family farmers but didn't once mention the need for land reform. Instead, he stated that family farms already manage most of the world's farmland. A whopping 70% of the food at the time, in 2014, that was produced in the world was produced by small farmers. This number is pretty similar even today. Another report published by various UN agencies in 2008 conclude that small farms occupy 60% of all arable land worldwide. Other studies have come to similar conclusions. But if most of the world's farmland is in small farmers' hands, then why are there so many of their organizations clamoring for land redistribution and agrarian reform? Because rural people's access to land is under attack everywhere. From Honduras to Kenya, from Palestine to the Philippines, people are being dislodged from their farms and their villages. Those who resist are being jailed or killed. Widespread agrarian strikes in Colombia, protests by community leaders in Madagascar, a nationwide march by landless folks in India, occupation in Andalusia. The list of actions and struggles goes on and on and on. Bottom line is that land is becoming more and more concentrated in the hands of rich and powerful, and small farmers are not doing well. This has only gotten worse with time. Rural people don't simply make a living off their land, after all. Their land and territories are the backbone of their identities, their cultural landscape, and the scope of their well-being. Yet land is being taken away from them and concentrated in fewer and fewer hands at an alarming pace. There's another side to this picture that concerns food. While it's now increasingly common to hear that small farmers produce the majority of the world's food, even if that is outside of market systems, we also constantly are being fed the message that, quote, more efficient industrial food system is needed to feed the world. At the same time, we are told that 80% of the world's hungry people live in rural areas, many of them farmers or landless farm workers. How do we make sense of all this? What is true and what's not? What actions do we need to take? Let's look at some numbers. I'm not going to read this page just because I want to, I want to get to the actual numbers. The vast majority of farms in the world today are small and getting smaller. By our calculations, over 90% of all farms worldwide are small, holding an average of 2.2 hectares of land. Even if we exclude China and India, where about half the world's small farms are located, from the calculations, small farms still account for over 85% of all farms on the planet today. Well, in 2014. In over 2/3 of all countries, small farms, as defined in each country, represent more than 80% of all farms. In only 9 countries, all of them in Western Europe, are small farms a minority. Due to a myriad of forces and factors such as land concentration, population pressure, or lack of access to land, most small farms have been getting even smaller over time. Average farm size has shrunk in Asia and Africa, In India, the average farm size roughly halved from 1971 to 2006, doubling the number of farms measuring less than 2 hectares. In China, the average area of land cultivated per household fell by 25% between 1985 and 2000, after which it slowly started to increase due to land concentration and industrialization. In Africa, average farm size is also falling. In industrialized countries where industrialization of agriculture is rampant, average farm size is increasing, but not the size of small farms. Now, this is the table of global distribution of agricultural land according to 2014. So, Africa has about 1,242,624 hectares of agricultural land. The number of farms on that land was 94,591. The number of small farms was 84,757. Now, small farms as a percentage of all farms in Africa at the time was nearly 90%. Agricultural land in the hands of small farmers, thousands of hectares, was 182,766,000 hectares. Sorry, I misread this before. This is 1,224,624,000 hectares. The percentage of agricultural land in the hands of these small farmers, which again, 89.6%, was 14.7%. The average size of small farms, hectares, was 2.2 hectares per farm. And as we go down the list, we can see in the Philippines, Asia Pacific. I don't know how I read that wrong. Larger land, number of farms, much higher. Number of small farms is very, very similar to the number of farms total. It's 94%, just about. Yet, they only had 34% of the land. The average size of small farms was 1.6 hectares. In China, 99% of farms were small farms, yet they owned only 70.9% of the land, with an average of 1.8 hectares per small farm. India, 92%, 39%. Europe, 88.5%, 17%. We just go on and on. So the main total is that 92.3% small farms constitute all farms globally as of 2014 from this meta-analysis. Yet only 24.7% of the global agricultural land was in the hands of these farmers. All figures on agricultural land obtained from Faustat. What is Faustat? I just want to know. Figures on numbers and size of farms obtained from national authorities whenever possible. You can download the full data set. I just want to see. By the way, guys, if anyone tells you that Wikipedia is not a good source, tell them to fuck right off, because it absolutely is. Food and Agricultural Organization Corporate Statistical Database. Website disseminates statistical data collected and maintained by Food and Agricultural Organization. Data are provided as time series from 1961 in most domains, 245 countries. Maintained by the Statistics Division of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations in working directly with countries. The Statistics Division supports the development of national statistical strategies and strengthening of institutions. These numbers are likely, I would say it's more likely that they are underestimated than they are overestimated. So, small farms being squeezed onto less than a quarter of global land. Globally, small farms have less than 25% of the world's farmland as of 2014. If we exclude India and China again, the reality is that small farms control a fifth of the world's farmland, 17.2% to be precise. India and China merit special attention because of the huge number of farms and farmers they are home to. In these two countries, small farms still occupy a relatively large percentage of farmland. I wonder if this has gotten worse over time as both China and India have industrialized. Now, where's my mouse? Come back, please. There we go. We find extreme disparities in some 30 or more countries for which we have sufficient data. Here, more than 70% of farms are small, but they are relegated to less than 10% of the country's farmland. The worst cases are listed in Table 2. The worst off countries in Africa are Algeria, Angola, Botswana, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Lesotho, Madagascar, Mali, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, and Zambia. In the Americas, Chile, Guyana, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and Venezuela. Iran, Jordan, Kyrgyzstan, Lebanon, Malaysia, New Zealand, Qatar, Turkmenistan, and Yemen. In Europe, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and Russia. As we can see in Table 1, in Africa specifically, we find that small farms in Africa represent almost 90% of all farms, but have less than 15% of total agricultural land. Our figures contradict the frequent assertion that most farmland in Africa is managed by small farmers. There's a source. It's the same article. Data on who uses what land in Africa are hard to get. Most African traditional land tenure systems have been seriously eroded and even dismantled, beginning in colonial times. In many countries, ownership of land has been vested in the state or allocated to plantation companies or local chiefs. This has profound implications for classifying land and accounting for use. Now, specifically, having this land in the hands of the state is not necessarily a bad thing if the state is a functional country. A lot of these countries have so many issues that the state can't really focus on regulating, and a lot of them want to industrialize. So when multinational corporations and rich people want to come and buy land, then they usually get what they want. Nationalizing the food industry is not a bad thing as long as the government that is nationalizing said industry is doing it in good faith, with proper regulation, proper oversight, and for the benefit of its citizens. Additionally, there is a problem in defining it and what constitutes agricultural land. In many cases, African governments measure, quote, agricultural land as the area being used by sedentary farmers at a given period of time, thereby leaving out large areas of land used by pastoralists for seasonal grazing. Also, land under fallow, shifting cultivation, and land used by communities that farm within forest areas are often excluded. By contrast, including permanent pastures, uncultivated savanna, and lands sown to permanent crops in its definition of agricultural land. As a consequence, most national consensus in Africa register just a fraction of the area of agricultural land recorded by the FAO, less than half as far as the entire region is concerned. The FAO's approach is more realistic and inclusive way of measuring land use by small producers, which is why we use FAO stat figures to establish the amount of farmland in Africa. This is actually quite good because there are lots of pastoralists, seasonal grazing. In living off the land is how a lot of people have functioned for like all of human history. So it's still common today in a lot of non-industrialized nations. and not measuring that as agricultural land is just misleading at best. Where land is assumed to belong to the state and is not accounted for as cropped or used by local farmers, this provides a basis for land grabbing by big farmers and companies, the rationale being that they will develop the unused land under customary law. However, these lands belong to local communities and are often actively used. Given that we use, whenever possible, national census data to provided by governments to calculate the amount of land in the hands of small farmers, it's possible and even likely that we underestimate the situation in Africa. Like I said before, these numbers are likely an underestimate, not an overestimate. Small farmers in Africa are probably using much more than 15% of the region's farmland than our data shows, but communities' access to the land is not guaranteed and can be lost at any given moment. And again, this is from 2014. We're fast losing farms and farmers in many places, while big farms are getting bigger. Almost everywhere, big farms have been accumulating more land over the last decade, with many small and medium-sized farmers going out of business. The statistics are dramatic, and the official data we were accessed summarized in Table 3, which is where we're getting to. The situation seems most dramatic in Europe, where decades of EU agricultural policies have led to the loss of millions of farms. In Eastern Europe, the process of land concentration started earnestly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the enlargement of the European Union. Millions of farmers were forced out of business by opening up Eastern European markets to subsidized farm produce from the West. In Western Europe, meanwhile, biased agricultural policies coupled with large-scale infrastructure, transportation, urbanization projects have been taking a vicious toll. Large farms now represent less than 1% of all farms in the European Union as a whole, but control 20% of EU farmland. A recent report by recent at the time, report by the European Coordination of La Via Campesina and the Hands Off of the Land Alliance found that the EU farms 100 hectares or more, which represent only 3% of the total number of farms, now control 50% of farmed land. So, for Africa, they found no official statistics on the evolution of farms and land concentration. Numerous research papers indicate that the great majority of countries and small farms are getting smaller because the population pressure such farmers have to share access to existing land among more people while gaining access to no new land. In the Asia Pacific between 1980 and 2005, Japan lost 60% of its farms under 2 hectares. Australia reported 22% fewer farms from 1986 to 2001, and then 15% fewer still from 2001 to 2011. In New Zealand, the number of farms has steadily decreased since the 1990s. The most affected farms are mid-sized, as number of small farms under 40 hectares and big farms over 800 hectares increased about 35% from 1999 to 2002. In Indonesia, a country that has been actively turning forests into agricultural land, the number of small farms increased 75% from 1963 to 1993, but the amount of land in their hands has increased less than 40%, as most newly deforested land has been transformed into big palm oil plantations from 1993 to 2008. The number of farms under half a hectare grew 50%, indicating that small farmers are being pressured to divide their holdings that they have. In Azerbaijan, 20% of farms disappeared between 2000 and 2011. In Bangladesh, 1996 to 2005, the number of farms rose 23%, but the number of landless rural families ballooned by 44%. In Europe, Western Europe, Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, and Norway lost about 70% of their farms since 1970s, and in some cases this trend is growing. In Eastern Europe from 2003 to 2010, Bulgaria, Estonia, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia lost 40% of their farms. Poland alone lost almost 1 million farmers between 2005 and 2010. Within the EU as a whole, over 6 million farms disappeared between 2003 and 2010, bringing the total number of farms down to almost the same level as 2000. before the inclusion of 12 new member states with 8.7 million new farmers. Let me just read that part again. In 2000, 8.7 million new farmers entered the European Union. And between 2003 and 2010, 6 million farms as a whole in the European Union disappeared. Argentina lost more than 1/3 of its farms in the 2 decades from 1988 to 2008. Between 2002 and 2008 alone, the decline was 18%. In the decade from 1997 to 2007, Chile lost 15% of its farms. The biggest farms, those holding more than 2,000 hectares, shrank 30% in number, but doubled the average size from 7,000 to 14,000 hectares per farm. In Colombia, small farmers have lost around half their land since 1980. In Uruguay, just since 2000, the number of farms has dropped 20%. This especially affects small farms. There are 30% fewer small farms, and yet they have 20% less land. The United States has lost 30% of its farms in the last 50 years. However, the number of very small farms has almost tripled, while the number of very large farms has more than quintupled. So there are more very small and very large farms, but fewer medium-sized farms. Official data on farm losses and land concentration in Africa and Asia are harder to get, and the situation is less clear since contradictory factors and forces are often at play. In many countries with high levels of population growth, the number of small farms actually increases as farms grow or divided up between children, but at the same time, land concentration in the hands of fewer people is growing. Now, the rapid expansion of huge industrial commodity farms is a relatively recent phenomenon in Africa, while it has been going on for a decade in other countries in Latin America. Soybeans in Argentina, Brazil, banana plantations in several parts of Asia, palm oil. Background and figures for a few major industrial crops. The conclusion is inescapable. Across the world, more and more fertile agricultural land is occupied by huge farms to produce industrial commodities for export, pushing small producers into ever-decreasing share of the world's farmland. Overwhelming as the pressures are, perhaps the single most important factor in the drive of pushing small and God, why can't I speak today? Perhaps the single most important factor in the drive pushing small and medium-sized farmers onto ever smaller parcels of land is the tremendous expansion of industrial crop farms. The powerful demands of food and energy industries are shifting farmlands and water away from local food production to the production of commodities for industrial processing. Graph 2, that's graph 2, shows just how 4 crops, soybean, oil palm, rapeseed, and sugarcane, have quadrupled the amount of land they occupy over the past 5 decades. All are grown mainly on big industrial farms. A massive 140 million hectares of fields and forests have been taken over by these plantations since the 1960s. To put things into perspective, this is roughly the same area as all of the farmland in the European Union. The invasion is clearly accelerating. Almost 60% of the land use change occurred in the last 2 decades. 3 decades. This doesn't take into account any of the other crops that are fast being turned into industrial commodity produced by mega farms or the tremendous growth of the industrial forestry sector. The FAO calculates that in developing countries alone, monoculture tree plantations grew by over 60% from 95 to 154 million hectares just between 1990 and 2010. Others put this figure higher and point that the trend is accelerating. Many of these new plantations are encroaching on natural forest, and they are increasingly taking over farmland. Let's have a look at this graph once it loads for us. So, as we can see, total global encroachment of industrial crops. All of these have been growing steadily. This graph past 2011 till today would be even larger. This is not a trend that has reversed or stopped. This has been getting worse since this article has been written, and we'll go over that in the next section. Phew, okay. A research team in Austria analyzed trade flows and agricultural crops in relation to land use. They concluded that global area of farmland dedicated to export crop production grew rapidly by about 100 million hectares during the past 2 decades, while the area producing crops for direct domestic use remained virtually unchanged. Without significant changes in government policies, this aggressive attack by commodity monocultures is set to expand further. According to the FAO, between now and 2050, the world's soybean area is set to increase by 1/3 to some 125 million hectares, the sugarcane area by 28% to 27 million hectares, and the rapeseed area by 16% to 36 million hectares. As for oil palm, there are currently 15 million hectares, currently as of 2015, under production for edible palm oil, not biofuels, and this is expected to nearly double with an additional 12 to 29 million hectares coming into production by 2050. Much of this expansion will happen in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Soybean and sugarcane are today mostly produced in Latin America, oil palm in Asia, and these crops are also now being pushed aggressively into Africa as part of the global wave of land grabbing. Now, I want to go on a little side tangent here about monocultures for crops. Just a short little side tangent. Monocultural crops are much more at risk of getting diseased and spreading. Bananas that we eat today, the Cavendish, you'll notice that banana flavored things taste very different than actual bananas. And that's because banana flavoring was produced with the species of banana that went extinct because of monoculture. And we introduced the Cavendish as a replacement for that. Now, that is also happening with the Cavendish. Let me actually search this up really quickly. Pull up a nice little article regarding it. Here we go. Now, this is going to be quite long and we're not going to read the whole thing, but as of 2021, this is from the National Library of Medicine, the vulnerability of bananas to global emerging disease threats. Banana cultivation has increased significantly over the last century to meet growing demand for popular fruit. Originating in Southeast Asia, bananas are now produced in 135 different countries in tropical and subtropical regions. Most of this expansion and production is based on a single banana variety, the Cavendish, which makes up almost all the export trade growth in large-scale monoculture and large part of the local trade, and represents more than 40% of all bananas grown globally. Over the last century, several major diseases of the banana have emerged and widely expanded their geographic ranges. Cultivars within the Cavendish variety are highly susceptible to these diseases, including yellow sigatoka, black leaf streak, you may see leaf spot, freckle, fusarium wilt, tropical, banana bunchy top, bacterial wilts, mako, xanthomonas wilt, and banana blood disease. This review graphically illustrates the emergence and rapid intercontinental spread of these diseases and discusses the several major disease epidemics in bananas. Evidently, the large-scale monoculture based on the single variety, Cavendish, has resulted in extreme levels of genetic vulnerability. The resistance and diversification of Cavendish production chain and the lack of investment in genetics and plant breeding in the recent past means that currently limited genetic solutions are available to replace the Cavendish banana with a set of market-acceptable resistance varieties. Again, we had to replace the previous species of banana with the Cavendish for this exact reason, and it's happening again with the Cavendish, and yet we have not done anything about it. We don't have anything to replace the Cavendish when this disease spreads enough to make it so that bananas are not readily available. You won't be able to go to, or they might be available if you live in countries like America or France or Germany, but they will be significantly more expensive because they'll be harder to obtain, harder to grow, and the cause of this is monoculture. When we plant one crop, just one singular crop, all over the place, that is what a monoculture is. That leaves these crops susceptible significantly more to diseases. And yet, we've known for centuries that when you grow several things next to each other, let's say you're growing some grain, and then you're growing some corn, and then you're growing something else next to it, the spread and development of these diseases is significantly less. If you have bananas growing, and then you have something else growing in between the next bananas, then the disease spreading from the bananas to the next bananas is less likely to happen. It's literally just that simple. God, I really need to stop this. Please, if you've never vaped, don't pick one up. Don't pick one up to quit smoking. Don't pick one up in general. These are terrible for you and terrible for the environment. The trend has been compounded by yet another recent phenomenon, the new wave of land grabbing. The World Bank has estimated that between 2008 and 2010, at least 60 million hectares of fertile farmland were leased out or sold to foreign investors for the purpose of large-scale agricultural production. More than half of this is in Africa. These massive agribusiness projects are throwing incalculable number of small farmers, herders, and indigenous people off their territories. Yet no one seems to have a real grasp of how much land has changed hands through these deals over the last few years. The score is possibly hundreds of millions of hectares of agricultural land being taken away from rural communities and are not yet captured in official statistics available for this report. Nope. Another way of looking at land distribution through the Gini index, a statistical tool that allows that ranges from 0, indicating perfect equality, to 1, total inequality. For example, when calculated for income distribution, countries with the Gini index above 0.5 are considered highly unequal. Grain gathered Gini indices for agricultural land distribution in more than 100 countries. Most have indices, I really can't pronounce that word, exceeding 0.5, with many reaching 0.8, and even some surpassing 0.9. In the Americas, all countries for which we found information indicate over 0.5, and most of them reach to 0.8 or 0.9. In Europe, the 25 countries for which this information is available, only 3 have an index of under 0.5, where more than a single year's data was available. The most common tendency for the index was to go up, indicating that land inequality is increasing. Despite their scarce and dwindling resources, small farmers continue to be the world's major food producer. At a time when agriculture is almost exclusively judged in terms of its capacity to produce commodities, one tends to forget the main role of farming is feeding people. This bias has infiltrated national census data too, as many nations do not include questions about who produces what and with what means. However, when that information is available, a clear picture emerges. Small farmers still produce most of the world's food. They are feeding the world. The UN Environment Programme, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, FAO, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food all estimate that small farmers produce up to 80% of the food in non-industrialized countries. Now, Table 4 shows the percentage of food produced by small farms in those countries where Graham was able to obtain good data across a diverse range of countries. The data shown, small farmers produce much larger proportions of their nation's food than might be expected from their limited holdings. Belarus, with 17% of the lands, small farmers produce 87.5% of fruits and berries, 82% of potatoes, 80% of vegetables, and 32% of eggs. Botswana, small farms are 93% of all farmers, have less than 8% of the agricultural land, and produce 100% of the country's ground nuts, 99% of the country's maize, corn, 90% of the Malay, 73% of beans, and 25% of the sorghum. I don't actually know what that is. Brazil, 84% of farms are small and control 24% of the land, yet they produce 87% of cassava, 69% of beans, 67% of goat's milk, 59% of pork, 58% of cow's milk, 50% of chickens, 46% of maize, 38% of coffee, 33.8% of rice, 30% cattle. Central America, with 17% of agricultural land, farmers account for 50% of all agricultural production. I'm not going to go through this whole table, but you can see, like, most of the food these countries produce is produced by small farms and small farmers, and yet they still hold significantly less land than the larger farms. So how does this happen? One reason is that small farms tend to be more productive than big ones, as we explained in the next section, but another factor is the historical constant. Small or peasant farm prioritize food production. They tend to focus on local and national markets and their own families. Much of what they produce doesn't enter national trade statistics, but it does reach those who need it most in rural and urban areas. They function as farms have for all of human history. You are a farmer, you grow food, you collect it, you use some of it to feed yourself and your family, and you sell the rest of it to your local region who aren't growing food. Or maybe you're growing one type of food and your neighbor is growing another thing and you exchange. This is how farming has functioned historically and still continues to in many of these countries. Big corporate farms, on the other hand, tend to produce commodities and concentrate on exporting crops, many of which can't eat as such. These include plants grown for animal feed and biofuels, wood products, and other non-food crops. The primary concern for corporate farms is the return on investment, which is maximized at low levels of spending and thus often implies less intensive use of land. Again, corporations exist solely for profit. That is their entire point. The expansion of giant monocultural plantations, as discussed earlier, is a part of this picture. Large corporate farms often have considerable reserves of land that lie unused until land that is currently being cropped or grazed is exhausted. Geez, that's sad. In a recent paper on small farmers and agroecology, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food concluded that global food production could be doubled within a decade if the right policies towards small farms and traditional farming were implemented. Reviewing the currently available scientific data, he shows that the agroecological initiatives by small farmers themselves have already produced an average crop yield of 80% in 57 developing countries, with an average increase of 116%. Among all African initiatives assessed, recent projects conducted, African countries provide a doubling of crop yields in a short period of just 3 to 10 years. The real question is how much more food could be produced if small farmers had access to more land and could work in a supportive policy environment rather than under siege conditions that they are facing today. We talk about global hunger all the time. Many people all over the world struggle to not only obtain food, but afford it when they can. And the reason for this is because less food is being grown and enters the international market instead of commodities that are not food. Like it said, wood, food for animals, biofuel, non-crop foods. Animal feed is important. Obviously, we do have animals to feed, but it does not need to take up as much land as it does and could be used more productively. Obviously, all of the land could be used more productively, as it says. Large corporate farms often have considerable reserves of land that lie unused until they exhaust the land that they are currently using. The word exhaust is really important here. They are killing the land that they use and then using the land that they are not using while that land heals, or even if it doesn't heal. Small farms not only produce most of the world's food, they are also the most productive. For some, the idea that small farms are more productive than big farms might seem counterintuitive. After all, we've been told for decades that industrial farming is more efficient and more productive. It's actually the other way around. The inverse relationship between farm size and productivity has long been established and is dubbed the productivity paradox. In the European Union, 20 countries register a higher rate of production per hectare on small farms than on large farms. In 9 EU countries, productivity on small farms is at least twice that of big farms. In 7 countries where large farms have higher productivity, it is only slightly higher than that of small farms. This tendency is confirmed by numerous studies in other countries and other regions, all of them showing higher productivity in small farms. Our data indicates, for example, that if all farms in Kenya had current productivity of the country's small farms, Kenya's agricultural production would double. In Central America, in Ukraine, it would almost triple. Again, Ukraine, breadbasket of Europe. In Hungary and Tajikistan, it would increase by 30%. In Russia, it would increase by a factor of 6. Big farms generally consume more resources, control the best lands, and receive most of the irrigation water and infrastructure, and get more financial credit and technical assistance, and are the ones for whom most modern inputs are designed. They have lower technical efficiency and therefore lower overall productivity. Much of this has to do with low levels of employment used on big farms in order to maximize return on investment. Most small farmers are women, but their contributions are ignored and marginalized. The role of women in feeding the world is not adequately captured by official data and statistic tools. The FAQ, for example, defined only as people who get a monetary income from farming as economically active in agriculture. Using this concept, FAO Stat indicates that 28% of rural population of Central America is economically active, and that women form just 12% of that group. This distorted view does not change significantly from country to country. However, when data is more specific, a totally different picture emerges. The last published agricultural census figures from El Salvador indicate that women are just 13% of producers, meaning farm holders, much in line with the numbers provided by the FAO. However, the same census indicate that women provide 62% of the labor force used on family farms. This situation in Europe is better for women, but is still highly unequal. The data shows that women comprise less than a quarter of farm holders on average, have smaller farms than men, but provide 50% of the family labor force. Statistics about the role of women in Asia and Africa are difficult to obtain. According to FAO Stat, only 30% of the rural population of Africa is economically active in agriculture, 40% in Asia, around 45% being women, 55% being men. Yet studies carried out and cited by the FAO show totally different numbers, indicating that in non-industrialized countries, 60 to 80% of the food is produced by women. In Ghana and Madagascar, women make up 15% of farm holders, but provide 52% of family labor and constitute about 48% of paid workers. In Cambodia, 20% of agricultural landholders are women, but they provide 47% of the paid agricultural force, almost 70% of the labor force on family farms. This goes on and on and on and on. Additionally, inheritance laws and customs often work against women. Males tend to have priority and outright exclusivity in inheriting land. In many countries, women can never gain legal control over land, with authority passing to their sons if they are widowed, for example. The data above supports the contention that women are the main food producers on the planet, although their contributions remain ignored, marginalized, and discriminated against. Reversing the trend, what we can do to stop this. Right, okay, we don't need to read the rest of this article. Now this landcoalition.org is, I looked this up before, but just for you guys, let me pull up their ownership. The International Land Coalition is a global alliance of civil societies and farmers organizations, United Nations agencies, NGOs,